this morning. Why am I here this morning? And what would I love to experience this morning? Set the goal. All you get of pure God consciousness for this morning, unless you want some for later. All right, so this morning we're going to be talking about communication. So I'm going to read to you from the course, just a little bit, a few paragraphs. So what we're going to do is talk about communication and what the Course in Miracles has to say about communication. And I have with me today Michael and Susan, two of my favorite communicators. They are communication teachers. They teach something called Imago Therapy. And so we're going to talk about communication, forgiveness, and relationships today. Okay? Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yes?
What kind of therapy?
Imago Therapy.
IMAGO?
Yes.
Isn't that the center of the butterfly?
I don't know.
I did a paper on that.
Wow.
I don't mean to, but it's just...
That's wonderful.
The inner, my paper was called The Inner Imago.
That's wonderful. So the way it's used here is the Imago is a template that each of us has in our mind for what we're looking for in a partner. It's an unconscious template. Consciously, we're looking for somebody who's nice looking, intelligent, sensitive, shared values, those things. On an unconscious level, there's this template in our mind that comes largely from positive and negative traits of our parents. Positive because we want more of the goodies, negative to heal what was wounded. And so that's where the Imago is used, but to have it be part of the butterfly makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you for that.
So I'm going to read to you from one particular section in chapter 4 called Creation and Communication. And so I'm going to tell you about what A Course in Miracles has to say about communication and the centrality of communication in the soul's evolution and the centrality of a new kind of communication in this particular curriculum. In this particular curriculum, the communication, a new kind of communication, is central to the accomplishment of this particular curriculum, as well as the soul's evolution. So we're going to talk about what the Course has to say about communication. We're going to talk about the two different types of systems of communication that are laid out in this particular section. And then we're going to go, it's the ego's communication system and the soul's communication system. And then kind of do a cost-benefit analysis between them, just in case you were not sure which one yielded more of what you say you want. And then I'm going to have Michael and Susan do a demo of a communication device, a technique that is profound in its ability to bring you more into alignment with your soul's communication system. Okay? So we're not just going to talk about a new way of being in communication, or the soul's communication, or God's communication, but we're actually going to give you a tool or technique that you can use so that your communication can come into alignment with Spirit's way of being in communication. Okay? Does that sound practical or valuable? All right. Could anybody use some tweaking of their communication system? Does anybody know of anybody who could use some tweaking in their communication system? Okay. All right. Okay. Just going to make sure I'm in the right place. All right. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to read to you a few paragraphs from chapter 4, and I think it's the 4th section or the last section in chapter 4, and it is called Communication and Creation. Does anybody need a book to look on?
Page 69.
All right.
In the second.
All right. Let's see where that is. Okay. So I'm just going to read the first few paragraphs, and then we're going to go from there. Does everybody see where it is? In my version, it's section 7 in chapter 4. I don't know what it is for you. So if you can't, is that what it is?
That's what mine is.
Okay. So that's.
Do you have a newer book up there with
I do. Here.
chapters and paragraphs?
I do.
Okay,
So you have an older version, so you need to go to table of contents. Okay. And it's the last section in chapter 4. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so it says, come on. It says, it's clear that while the content of any particular ego illusion doesn't matter, its correction is more helpful in a specific context. That's because ego illusions problems are quite specific, even though the mind is naturally abstract. Part of the mind becomes concrete, however, when the mind splits. The concrete part of the mind believes in the ego, which is the fearful mind. Why? Because the fearful mind depends on the concrete. The ego is the part of the mind that believes your existence is defined by separateness, separation. Okay, that's what the ego is. I'm defined by how I'm different. Does anybody recognize that? Who I am is defined by how I'm different. That's my ego. Then it says, everything the ego, the separate mind, perceives is a separate whole, without the relationships that imply being. Interesting, relationships imply being. That's why the ego is against communication. The ego is against communication, except insofar as the communication is utilized to establish separateness rather than to abolish it, okay? So the ego ain't into communication, except if it can use communication to show people how you're different than them. I'm different from you. You're not like me. I'm not like you. That's the only kind of communication my ego's into, okay? And the reason why my ego is not into communication is because communication, relationships imply being. So communication brings you or reminds you that you're in relationship. And the ego isn't into relationship. The ego's into separateness. So there's relatedness and there's separateness. Ego's into separateness. Okay? So this says, the communication system of the ego is based on the ego's own thought system, as is everything else the ego dictates. The ego's communication is controlled by its need to protect itself, and so our ego will disrupt communication when our ego experiences threat. Now, this disruption is a reaction to a specific person or persons. The specificity of the ego's thinking then results in spurious generalizations, which is really not abstract at all. The ego merely responds in certain specific ways to everything it perceives as related. In contrast, spirit relates only with what is true which means now we're getting into spirit's communication system. And that means that spirit, your loving right mind, doesn't respond at all to anything else besides what's true. And your loving right mind knows, your loving right mind doesn't make any attempt to establish what's true. Your loving right mind knows that what is true is everything that God created, and your loving right mind is in complete and direct communication with every aspect of creation because it's in complete and direct communication with its creator. Now, this communication that we just described in this paragraph, that communication is the will of God. How interesting that the will of God, what God wants for you, is a type of communication. Who knew? That's the will of God, a type of communication that you are in with everything and the source of everything. And as a matter of fact, creation and communication are synonymous. How is that? That's because God created every mind by communicating his mind to it, thus establishing it forever as a channel for the reception of God's mind and will. Since only beings of a like order can truly communicate, God's creations naturally communicate with him and like him. We naturally communicate with God and like God. We communicate like God. Wouldn't that be nice to know how that goes? Communicating like God. And this communication that we do is perfectly abstract since its quality is universal in application, which means it's not subject to any judgment, any exception, or any alteration. God created you by communication and for communication. How interesting. God created me to communicate, and God created me by communicating with me. Who knew? And he says, now, your mind can distort your function, its function of communicating. But your mind cannot endow itself with functions it wasn't given. And that's why your mind cannot totally lose the ability to communicate, even though your mind may refuse to utilize your ability to communicate on behalf of being. I'm just going to read one more paragraph, and then we're going to stop there. Okay. Existence, as well as being, rests on communication. Interesting. My being, my existence rests on communication. Existence, however, is specific in how, what, and with whom communication is judged to be worth undertaking. Being, though, is completely without these distinctions. Being is a state in which the mind is in communication with everything that is real. Now, whatever extent you permit this state of communication to be curtailed, you are limiting your sense of your own reality, which becomes total only by recognizing all reality in the glorious context of its real relationship to you. This is your reality. Don't desecrate it. Don't recoil from it. It is your real home, your real temple, and your real self. What is my real home, my real temple, and myself? It is a state where I am in communication, real communication with others and with the source of others. Interesting that that's my real home, my real self, my real being is a state of mind where I'm in real communication with others and with the source. Okay? And whatever extent to which I curtail that state of being in communication, then I curtail my sense of being. Interesting connection between how well I am in communication with others and my own sense of being. How interesting. All right. So now, let's review the two communication systems. So the ego's communication system, and tell me if you recognize any of this. First of all, the ego's communication, or why don't we just go ahead and say our old way of communicating. Our old way of being in communication with other people is, number one, it is disruptive when it experiences threat. So in my old way of communicating with people, when I felt threatened, I stopped talking. Okay? Anybody recognize that? I give them the silent treatment. Right? Or when I'm in my ego, when I'm in fear, then the only time I'm really going to communicate is when I can tell you why we're different. Okay, do you recognize that? I'm not going to tell you about how our sameness is. I'm not going to tell you about how one we are and how much I appreciate you. I'm going to tell you about how we're different. Right? And when I don't like what I'm hearing, I am going to interrupt you. I'm going to disrupt communication. Are there any professional disruptors in here? Thank you. Me too. I can do a silent treatment like nobody's business. So that's the ego's communication system. It doesn't talk to other people to share how we're the same and how we're alike and what we all have equally. It only talks to establish differences, separateness. And when it feels threatened, it disrupts the communication. Okay, do you notice that? Okay. And the reason that my ego doesn't like communication is because every time we communicate with each other for real, we get that we're the same. That's why my ego doesn't like it. Right? So that's the ego's way of communicating. That's the ego's communication system. It only is about protecting itself. The ego's communication is only about protecting itself. Okay? Now, your soul's communication system, the Holy Spirit's communication system, is something that, number one, for starters, doesn't only talk to its object, the object in front of it. Holy Spirit's communication system is always communicating with everything and with God. Okay? So the communication of Holy Spirit is not disruptive when it experiences threat, and it communicates to find sameness, or to find relatedness, to find connection. Okay? So that's how you can tell some of the difference between when you're in your ego and when you're in your right mind. Does that make sense? Okay, does anybody relate to that? Okay. There was another one where it said another characteristic of Holy Spirit's communication. Oh yeah. It doesn't respond at all to anything but love. And it doesn't try to establish what's true. So, your soul's communication isn't trying to tell people what's so. It's not trying to establish what's true. You ever notice that ego is always like trying to tell people what's so? You ever notice that? I'm going to tell you what's so. I'm going to tell you what's so about you, and I'm going to tell you what's so about me. But loving communication isn't trying to tell people what the truth is. It's not trying to establish what's true. And then the other thing is that loving communication isn't responding to anything but love in that dialogue with another human being. In other words, I'm not even focusing on the ego, your ego. I'm not about trying to correct your ego. Loving real communication is me not trying to focus on what's not true. It's not trying to establish what is true. And what does it say? It doesn't respond at all to anything but the love. Either the love or the call for love. So when you're in dialogue with another human being, and it's real communication, the kind of communication you have with God and God has with you, you're not responding to anything but the love in them, love or call for love. You're not sitting there trying to tell them what's the case, what's true. And that person that you're talking to isn't the only one you're in communication with. You're also in communication with everything, with Source. You see the difference? Okay. So now this topic of communication is extremely important because communication is creation. So the quality at which you're communicating determines the quality with which you are creating. So you remember how the Course says that nothing comes into being without some kind of joining? Remember that? Well, it's the same as saying nothing comes into being without communication. The way that we create, meaning bring forth, is the exact same way that we were brought forth. We were brought forth through a communication, and we create and bring forth and manifest also through communication. So how we communicate determines how creative we are. It determines how well you manifest, how well you create. So the topic of communication is really important. Do you see the importance of it in this particular curriculum? If it's true that communication is creation, and let's say you experience any lack, any lack comes from I'm not experiencing the power of my creativity. Lack means I'm not experiencing myself as having a creativity power, right? Well, if I'm experiencing lack, then that means I'm not communicating. I'm not communicating. If communication is creation and I'm experiencing lack, there is something I'm not communicating, or I'm not communicating. So when I communicate to find differences, I'm not communicating. I'm attacking. I'm separating. That's not communication. So we want to really bring into focus how we communicate, why we communicate, and with whom we're communicating, correct? If communication is creation. So with that, what I want to do now is I want to let Michael and Susan demonstrate and give you guys a really powerful, profound technique by which to bring your own communication more into a line with Spirit's communication, your soul's communication. A very useful technique so that you're communicating more like Spirit. You're not projecting, you're not communicating to establish differences, but something that you can use to refine and evolve the way you communicate so that you can experience yourself as the powerful creator and joiner that you were meant to be. Because remember, God's will for you is communication. God's will is communication for you. That's what God wants for you. All right, does that sound good? All right, so this is Michael and Susan again, and they're going to tell you about this technique or this skill, and they're going to demonstrate it.
Thank you, Al.
You're welcome.
Hi, folks.
Hi.
So I'm not exactly going to follow what Donna said.
Oh my God.
Because that's the kind of guy I am.
Yeah, that is
Renegade.
true. I'm a witness.
But we'll move in that general direction. And just a bit of background of what we're doing here. I've been a Course in Miracles student, and it's been my really spiritual path since 1985. I think Susan started making it her life path in 93. And I've been connected with this center. I taught some classes here, I'm guessing 10 years ago, in practical applications of the course. So I'm wanting to let you know how special I am right from the beginning. And about 1998, I was introduced to something called Imago relationship therapy. I'm a psychotherapist, and one of my clients wanted me to learn about this because they were attracted to the model and they didn't want to start with a new therapist, so they gave me a book to read and a videotape, and it turned me on. And I've been with this practice in my work with couples and families and even individuals. And one of the pieces of Imago relationship therapy is a dialogue structure for a number of purposes. It ideally is used whenever we're looking at things differently than another person. Anybody here ever have the experience of having a different way of looking at things?
You mean like a disagreement?
Yeah, disagreement.
Oh, yeah.
And but it's also a wonderful way to just express what's going on inside of us, or to learn about another person, and it's a way of joining. And so I became struck by how powerful this process was in my practice as a Course in Miracles student. And Anna came to the course a long time ago and came to Imago and also was struck by how powerful this method is for joining with people. And so normally when we have an argument, I'm not listening for the essence of what you have to tell me. I'm looking for the holes in your argument so that I can use those to show you that you're wrong and I'm right. And what's more, part of the time you're explaining your position, I'm not listening to you because I'm rehearsing my answers to you. Is that at all familiar to anybody, those things? That's normal. That's what people normally do when we argue. And Imago offers us a different way of approaching when we have disagreement. And they offer us a structure. And in Imago, excuse me, I want to be able to see people here. In Imago, we talk of containment, structure, and process. That the beginning of a conscious relationship is being able to contain our reactivity. If we're coming from our reactivity with someone, we're in trouble, because generally then they come from their reactivity, and then we're both being reactive. Nothing useful comes from that. So containing reactivity is the beginning of conscious connection. And then structure. Structure creates safety. And safety is what allows us to open our hearts. I look at love as what comes through our hearts when we open our hearts. And when it's not safe, we constrict and we close our hearts. And so this dialogue process is a structure that creates safety for both participants, and then process, that we're in process. We're not where we were perhaps 2 months ago. We're not all the way where we want to be. We're in process. So we're going to talk a little about the structure of the Imago dialogue. And these dialogues always begin with an appointment. And an appointment is basically an agreement to have the conversation. Very often people will start to throw things at each other when the other person wasn't prepared to have that conversation or may not have even wanted to, and those conversations don't tend to go brilliantly. So we have an appointment, and the way we do this in how we teach this dialogue structure is by making an appointment that also expresses an intention. And the appointment phrase goes, I'd like us to cross the bridge into each other's world using Imago dialogue. Would now be a good time. Ideally, now's a good time, but if it isn't, then we set a time to have this dialogue. And then in the dialogue process, at any moment, there are two roles. There's the sender, the person who's sharing their thoughts and feelings, and there's the receiver. And the receiver's job is to cross the bridge and really get what's going on for their partner. Their job is not to defend their position. In fact, they kind of need to put their position off to the side in order to really get what their partner is saying. And the skills that they bring to get what their partner is saying are mirroring, validating, and empathizing. The mirroring is similar to what you may have heard about active listening or reflective listening, where you're basically repeating back what the other person says using their words. People's words are precious to them. We identify with our words. And when someone repeats back our words, we feel heard. When they interpret our words, maybe we do, maybe we don't. But when they use our words, we feel heard. So we teach a word-for-word mirroring process. And when our partners feel gotten, that their words have been heard, something in them relaxes. When we argue, we usually are not getting their words, and they feel more like they have to defend their position. So the person sending goes until they're complete with what they're saying. The only thing that their partner or friend does besides mirror is if they pause for a long time, they may ask, is there more? As though they're really interested. Normally when we have a disagreement, we can't wait for our other person to shut up so that we can tell them the truth. But in this case, is there more? And the person continues until they're complete, and then the receiver moves into a state of validation. Validation doesn't mean we agree, just that they make sense. And we teach 4 sentences that are very joining in this process. The first is, I listen carefully to what you say. The second is, what you say is important to me. These are healing things for people to hear. The third, some people choke on, is your perspective is as valid as mine. Some people find that hard to say, but it's a wonderful thing to get in touch with and to admit with another person. And finally, you make sense. Doesn't mean we agree with the person, but just that what they say makes sense. And we name a couple of things that make sense about what they said. I did come home late last night, and I didn't call you, and you've told me before about that. And then we go into an empathy phase where we guess at a couple of feelings that the other person has, and I guess you're disappointed and angry. Are those your feelings? And they say, yes, I was disappointed and I was angry. Are there other feelings? I was frustrated. Oh, and you were frustrated. And all those feelings make sense. So what we've done is we've mirrored the other person. We've let them truly be heard. Then we validated their thinking process. We've let them know that their thinking makes sense. May not be the way we think, but their thinking makes sense, and that the feelings that they have make sense. When a person has that experience of being mirrored and validated and empathized with, they feel gotten. They don't have to fight. They don't have to escalate. They don't have to leave the room. And then the person who's been the receiver says, I'd like to respond. And then they change roles, and and the new sender begins with something I appreciate or something that touched me that you said was, tells them something that was meaningful, and then goes into what comes up for me around this, and then explains their perspective, and their partner or friend crosses the bridge into their world. So that's a lot of information. There are ways that we have for you to get more information. We will demonstrate the process. Before I do, any relatively short questions? Okay, we'll save one.
I'd just like to make a quick comment about how the bridge between this particular dialogue structure and forgiveness, as the Course in Miracles talks about it.
I meant to do
Yeah, go
that.
ahead.
So, this relates to the Course in a number of ways. One is that in the glossary index on the Course in Miracles, when talking about love, says love can only be experienced or known once the barriers of guilt have been removed through forgiveness. When we cross the bridge into another person's world and get the information about their experience and what was going on for them, we realize that what they did was not an attack. At worst, it was a call for love. And it becomes much easier to forgive. It's also easier when we really see what's going on for our partner to realize that our interests are indeed joined. And then when our partner does that same for us and validates us and empathizes with us, it reinforces the fact that our interests are joined. We're really connected. It takes us out of a polarity where there are two different positions, only one right, one wrong, and then we're just arguing over who that is, into where we're on the same side. There are two valid positions. Okay, from this, what can we do about it? And now we're in a state of being joined, wondering how we can take both positions into consideration and create something that works for both of us. So it creates us out of that, it moves us out of that mind of separation into a joined experience. The Course is designed to save us time. Because we're all going the same place anyway, in truth. But the Course is valuable to us because it saves us time. What I believe the three of us have found is that this dialogue process saves us time in our practice of the Course.
Yeah, it saves us, it gets us to the goal of forgiveness and unity faster.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So Susan and I will do a demonstration of this process. We'll do a dialogue that we have not had.
And would you guys like me to say, okay, now they're doing the validation, now they're...
Maybe Susan might do that.
If you're okay with that. I'm perfect with that. Okay.
So I'm just going to move so that I can be facing Susan in a way that I don't have my back.
Does that work?
Begin.
I'd like to begin. Okay. So I'd like us to cross the bridge. Can people hear me?
And you might want to talk a little bit louder though.
Okay. I'd like us to cross the bridge into each other's world with an Imago dialogue. Is now a good time?
Yes.
I'd like to talk about my packing up the car this morning.
I'm going to interrupt the editorial comment. We do a one-sentence overview to name the topic that's going to be discussed. Some people have a meandering way of leading into an issue, and the other person doesn't know what minefield they're about to be walking into. So by naming the subject, it gives the other person the idea of what this will be about. So you would like to dialogue about getting into the car this morning?
About loading the car this morning.
About loading the car this morning.
Right. So what's happened is I've made an appointment and I've given him the subject matter. And now I'm going to flesh this out. So I had asked you earlier this morning if you would be willing to help me load the car.
So you asked earlier in the morning if I would be willing to help you load the car.
Right. And my understanding was that yes, you would help me.
And your understanding was that yes, I would help you.
And when push came to shove, it seemed like I was in go mode and you were needing to sort of catch up with what you personally needed to do.
So as it occurred, it seemed like you were mostly in go mode and I was mostly in catching up with what I needed to do.
Personally. Right. So I felt the burden of needing to load the car by myself this morning and was not real happy about that.
And you felt the burden of having to load the car this morning by yourself and you were not real happy about that.
Right.
Is there more?
Yes. So in the future, I am putting in a request for your taking the time to do your personal stuff well enough in advance so I have some of Michael time to help load the car.
So you're putting in a request for the future for me to allow enough time in addition to my own stuff to be able to help with the group stuff.
Correct.
Is there more?
And if that's not to be resolved today, but I want you to consider it.
So if that can't be resolved today, you'd like me to consider that?
Right.
So in summary?
Yes. So this is the first part of the validation.
And the validation begins with the summary mirror. The summary lets the partner know if they are understood. The line-by-line mirroring, word for word, lets them know that they've been heard. Now we'll find out if I've understood what Susan was saying. So this morning, you had asked me if I would help load the car, and I said yes. And when the time came, it seemed like you were doing almost all the loading and that I was finishing up on my own stuff rather than helping with much of the loading. And you're requesting that in the future I allow enough time, get up early enough, this is how it translates to me, get up early enough to do my stuff plus load the car. And if we can't resolve this now, for me to be considering it.
Yes.
Is that a good summary?
Yes.
So I've listened carefully to what you said. What you say is important to me. Your perspective is as valuable as mine, and as valid as mine, and you make sense. And what makes sense is that you did ask me for help. I said I would, and that I was mostly on my stuff, and that you would want me to allow time in the future. And now I'll step into the empathy part. I imagine you were feeling disappointed, irritated, frustrated. Are those your feelings?
Yes. I felt disappointed, irritated, and frustrated.
Were there other feelings?
Yes. Hopeful.
Hopeful, and you're hopeful. And
Hopeful that
it will be
we can-
different in the
we
future.
will resolve this.
Yes, and all those feelings make sense. I can see how you have those feelings. I'd like to respond.
So now I'm going to be listening to him.
Yeah, now he's a new sender, she's a receiver now.
Correct.
Something that touched me that you said was that it couldn't be resolved right now, take to consider it, and
So I'd like to do that.
yeah.
So this is a pause button.
I forgot. We use the pause button here as a signal from the receiver to pause, either right then or at the next comma, so that they can mirror. And it's a way for the receiver to have some control over the pace of the send. Some of us are more extroverted and the words just pour and pour and pour, and the more introverted of us can get overwhelmed. And so the pause button is a very nice system to use in this dialogue and in other conversations to create more equality between the two people in the conversation.
So something that touched you about what I said is that you appreciated the fact that if we don't resolve this today, that we can do this at a later time.
And I was also appreciated that you wound up doing most of what you had asked not to do.
And you also appreciated that I did do most of the stuff that I did not want to do by loading the car.
Yeah. And what comes up for me is a bit of sheepishness feeling.
And what comes up for you is a bit of sheepishness feeling.
To display my less than perfection in front of this audience.
What audience? Sheepishness to display your less than perfection in this front of this audience.
Yeah. And part of me wants to defend myself by saying some of the things I was doing were to get together for this presentation.
A part of you wants to defend yourself and say that part of what you were doing was to get things ready for this presentation.
Yeah. But clearly, I should have gotten up earlier.
But clearly, you should have gotten up earlier.
Yeah. And I will do my best to be more realistic about my timing on these mornings.
And you will do your best to be more realistic about your timing on these mornings.
And also, because I do the driving, and I figured I'd be helping to empty on the other end, I did kind of hold it that the loading might be more of your on your plate than mine.
So, and because you were doing the driving, and you figured that you would be helping me with the unloading when we come down here, that you did sort of figure that that was sort of a part of the...
But should have been that it was more your stuff.
That it was more my stuff.
But I should have told you that if that's what I thought, and we should have talked about it.
But you should have told me that if that's what you thought, and we should have talked about it.
Yeah, so I'm sorry about that.
And you're saying you're sorry about that. Thank you. So, in summary, what you're saying is, it looks like...
Yeah, time-wise, Susan would do a summary now, and I know she would do a good summary, and she would validate my position. And I know we need to leave in 5 minutes. Do you get a sense of this from this? Yeah, nowhere are we arguing. I'm willing to report on my defensiveness, but reporting on defensiveness and coming from defensiveness, going, well, you should have done that because after all I was driving, would create a very different feeling. But we can report on our defensiveness, we can report on our fear or guilt or judgment, the voices of the ego. But it's different to report on those from a more intentional witness place than to come from that place in our interactions. So, this is a service, and our intention today was to serve you by letting you know about something that may be of interest to your practice, to your life. We have a sheet of paper with ways of getting more information about the Imago dialogue. There's a book, there's a website, and then we do a dialogue cafe where we teach that. That's there. But we want to be very careful that this be a service today and not a promotion. but we do want to let you know it's available. Question?
Point of information, is this derived from neuro-linguistic programming?
No,
It's very similar.
it is. I was trained as a neuro-linguistic programmer long time ago with Brenda and Bandler and those folks. So it has some consistent pieces, and the fact that it's a model of what works, so much of neuro-linguistic programming is modeling what works. This is a model of what works in communication.
Is it Harville Hendricks?
It is Harville Hendricks, yes.
And can you guys see how that particular dialogue structure would accomplish what the course was talking about as Holy Spirit's system of communication?
Yes.
You see, it's a system of communicating based on joining instead of differences.
Could you see how that same situation, one person did most of the work in the morning after the other person said they'd help? Could you see that could lead to it doesn't
divorce
in this?
It has.
To a divorce, right?
Yes.
It has.
Yeah, it has. This is our third marriage, both of us, and we're together. We're together 22 years. We know how to do it the other way, and we know how to do it this way. And I never dreamed I'd be so happy. I'm stunned.
Beautiful. So there's flyers about Michael and Susan and their workshops and their classes and their practice. I have my. Are there? And I
No,
also
I
have.
don't have any of those up. I'll put some up.
Okay. And then I have my cards up here as well. I'm also an Imago therapist as well as a course teacher. And then we do something here called the Dialogue Cafe, where people come in with another person or by themselves so that we can practice the dialogue. Practice. And it's a donation, it's done on a donation basis. It's a fabulous place to come practice this dialogue technique so that you can use it everywhere with everyone, so that you can be in real communication with everyone, everywhere, and get all the benefits of that. So come join us for that if that seems like something that you could benefit from. And then I do my class every Monday night here at 7:30. Every Monday, 7:30 here, my own course class. Yes?
I don't know, Michael might have a sign-up sheet.
Okay.
I believe Michael's getting a sign-up sheet right now. For those of you who would like to get a copy of the Imago dialogue that we use at the Dialogue Cafe, we'll have you, we'll pass around something that you can give us your email address, and also we can send you the flyer for the Dialogue Cafe electronically rather than on my paper if you wanting to go green. Okay?
All
So I'm
right.
going to step up for just a second.
So, any questions or comments before we close up about, like, what was that like to watch that dialogue process? And, what was that like to watch that?
I think it's extremely helpful, and I would like to achieve that goal to get there. But there was part of me that wanted to laugh out loud, and I wish that people could see my dialogue process because I need a lot of work.
Come to the Dialogue Cafe so that everyone can see your dialogue process.
It's almost uncomfortable. To be honest, it appeared artificial to me. But I want to be able to be. I need the connection.
Yes. Need to
May I?
practice.
May I respond?
Oh,
It seemed artificial. I mean, you appreciated it.
I appreciate it.
And yet it seemed artificial. And you know what's really artificial to me? This.
Anybody recognize that?
That's really artificial. My body does not naturally move like that. But that's how I get home. That's how I get to Boulder. That's how I drive. I mean, learning a skill is artificial.
At first.
This is hard. I don't stand like this. So this is artificial when we learn it. I don't know what you're
That's helpful to me. That's helpful because I think God is
But it's not at all artificial for Susan and I.
Right.
It's,
Well,
Well, what
And then-
we happened is we learned the artificial way And so when you are presented with the natural way, it seems artificial at first.
Can I make an observation too? I think what we're really after is a state of mind that is shared.
Yes.
So if we go through exaggerated behavior and expression,
That's right.
then we're reinforcing our state of mind. And then after the mind relaxes, we'll all do this in a natural way all the time.
Exactly. Forgiveness isn't natural to us.
Yeah.
And it is, at first, seems artificial to go, let me remember you did nothing. Right? That seems artificial to apply the truth when you think something's been done to you. But once you apply it, then you come to realize, oh, there really is nothing to forgive. We really are the same. So thank you for saying that.
Just like to say thank you for bringing this to us, because I've sort of been introduced to little chunks of that, but not all of it, and it was very helpful to see the whole thing played out. I agree, in the beginning it sounded a little artificial, but as it went on, to me, it took on real life, and it felt very comfortable, and I'm assuming that this is what it would look like if you two had that conversation at home.
Exactly.
I'm a witness.
Exactly.
That's exactly what it looks like.
Yeah. We live this. You know, I've had 2 10-year marriages, and this is very different. So we're going to put up a sheet here. If you want us to send you the dialogue structure by email or send you an invitation, we have some invitations here, but if you don't want to use paper and you'd like to get it on your computer, put the name, first name is fine, or both, email address, and then check whether you want the dialogue structure sent to you or the invitation to the Dialogue Cafe. And if you don't do the invitation to the Dialogue Cafe, we won't send that to you. We don't want to, we won't give this list to anybody, and it's just if you want.
Yes.
Have you ever used this in a business context?
Yes. Yes. And but I've used it in counseling people to work with either employers or coworkers, but I've also taught people in a business to use it with each other. And in fact, do you remember the book, The 1 Minute Manager? Well, that book was largely mirroring. It was largely having the worker and the manager agree on what the assignment was and what the criteria for excellence was. Bless you. Bless you all.
And I use it with kids and parents, teens and parents. I use it in my family therapy practice. So its application is across the board. It's with anyone that you are in communication with, where there's conflict.
Yeah. I mean, if you're both doing it, it makes a tremendous difference. If you're only doing it and you're doing some mirroring and some validation, some empathy, it'll change the tenor of that conversation, if not immediately, within a couple of conversations.
Yeah. You can stop a speeding projection heading your way, in no time flat. I hear that you think that I'm a big fat idiot. Did I get that? Is there more?
Yeah.
It somehow takes the steam out of that barreling projection. Okay?
Where's the basket?
Oh yes. Where is the basket?
In the basket file.
Anybody? Okay, thank you. Any other, as we're getting the basket, any other questions or comments about what that was like to see that, practical applications of that, connections between the dialogue you saw and then what we learned about communication in the course today? Any questions or comments around that?
So if you were just going to do this with another person who was not aware of what you were doing, and you already had the combative conversation, so now you're going to have a follow-up conversation,
Yeah.
would you make a few little notes and do it face-to-face, or would the phone be okay?
I think either way, and I might cue it up by saying, I wasn't real pleased with how I handled our interaction last night. I'm wondering, could we do do-overs? Let's pretend it's just beginning. I want to try and respond differently. And then try and do your end differently and see if it doesn't shift.
I hear you, thank you, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you, that was very helpful.
You are welcome.
I was wondering because I have been wanting to come, but I have a commitment that ends at 6 o'clock.
Uh-huh.
So, you say that you start at 6 o'clock sharp.
No,
6:30.
Oh, that don't mean that really.
Six-
Come ahead and go.
6:30. It starts 6:30.
6:30.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe it is possible after all. Yeah,
Yeah.
it starts at 6:30.
Yeah.
All right.
You are welcome.
Yeah. And since you already have had something of an intro to it, it's okay if you come a few minutes later, because the first part of the Dialogue Cafe is where we teach people the dialogue and about it
Structure.
and the structure.
Yes, I read the book about that.
Wonderful. Any other questions or comments about that? Okay.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
all right, so it can work if you're the only one doing it, you just.
Yeah, you just add some mirroring, and if if they call you on it, what are you doing that for? I'm just wanting to make sure that I'm understanding. Yeah, sometimes when I talk to people I miss, so I want to make sure I hear you, that I'm hearing you right. So you may not do it as formally as Susan and I just did it, but you can bring those same elements and they will help. Two people helps even more.
So I appreciate you guys coming out today. Appreciate you being present and open and sharing openly. Thank you for being here today. And
There's donuts in the.
oh, and there's donuts in the kitchen.
And one thing I'll mention is we teach a fabulous workshop for couples. If you know any couple that wants to have an even better relationship than they have, we teach a great workshop. Good relationships get better, struggling ones find a very different way to do it.
Your relationship, from what I've seen, I'm not in your home, but kind of gives me hope.
Well, you've seen us over,
Yeah.
you've seen us over a number of years.
Yeah,
over a
years, I
10-year
sure have.
period, so.
Yeah, so I got hope. I got hope. I
Yeah.
got hope.
There is hope. All right, thank you
Thank
guys.
you all.